Good morning, everybody. Once again, if life is accurate, today is Wednesday, the 1st of April, and I've been informed by my social media that April Fool's has been canceled because there is nothing that any of us can make up that is any weirder than what's going on in the real world. So everything that you will hear from me today is in fact true and not an April Fool's joke. So today we are going to be talking about Milton Friedman, the next to last member of our contemporary economists, most influential economists of the 20th century. And if you remember me telling you previously, he is the only person on our list of influential economists that I have actually had the pleasure of meeting. It turns out that Milton Friedman's son is involved with the same historical society that I'm involved in, and we've actually had the opportunity to sword fight each other in the past. And it was many, many years ago, actually shortly after he won the Nobel Prize, that I was able to actually meet him and shake his hand. What we're going to be talking about today is a little bit about his career and how he advanced to become one of the most noted economists of the 20th century. And we are going to talk about some of his rather unusual economic philosophies. It's important to note that Milton Friedman, much like Friedrich Hayek that we talked about yesterday, was quite opposed to the economic principles espoused by John Maynard Keynes. And in fact, both Friedman and Arthur Laffer, who we will be talking about tomorrow, have actually been on the economic advisory councils for several presidents, world leaders. And the number one issue that both of them have come up against is the tendency for government to lean on the teachings of John Keynes. And these guys have had to attempt to counter the mindset in the governments in order to make their economic philosophies heard at that national level. So the first thing to know about Milton Friedman, he is touted as the founder of the Chicago School of Economics. In the Chicago School, he was basically teaching at the University of Chicago. He was an advocate of what's called the Chicago price theory. And this was, we'll talk about it as part of his monetary philosophy and his ideas of monetarism. But the idea of Chicago price theory involved a significant number of members of the economics department in the University of Chicago, specifically as a counter to the price theories that had been put forth by earlier economists, including John Keynes. As a matter of fact, Milton Friedman was actually heard to refer to Keynesian theory as naive Keynesian theory, starting in the late 1950s. He was the winner of the 1976 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, and the topics that he had been addressing that led to his nomination was research on consumption analysis, the history of monetary policy, and the theory and complexity of what's called stabilization policy, or economic stabilization is another term for that. Some of his students went on to become great economists in their own right. If you read his biography in the handouts, you've read the names Gary Becker, Robert Fogel, Thomas Sowell, and Robert Lucas Jr. Of those, Thomas Sowell is probably the one that you've run into the most often. He is quite vocal in modern politics, and at least on Facebook, has been the subject of numerous memes regarding libertarian and classic liberal policies in economic thought in the government. So Milton Friedman is somebody who has made a significant impact. He has been a guest lecturer at numerous colleges and universities around the country, including Harvard, Princeton, Yale. He was on the Economic Advisory Council for Ronald Reagan. He was an economic advisor for Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister of Great Britain. And has been actually touted. If you've ever heard of a magazine called The Economist, it's an international magazine that deals with political science and economics. The Economist actually stated at one point in time that he was, quote, the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century, perhaps for all of it, unquote. So they definitely, and the Economist leans towards the conservative viewpoints, but they definitely consider him to be the most influential, even more so than either Keynes or von Mises. So two main points that we are going to talk about here is the concept of social responsibility, and we will also talk about his theories of monetarism. And just like every other presentation so far this week, if you are to go back and review these slides directly through Google Classroom, you will see play links identified, which will take you to a couple of YouTube videos that are very informational on the life and mindset of Milton Friedman. And I will post those links in the classroom feed on Google Classroom as well. So let's look at the idea of social responsibility of business. Anybody that has been on social media at all in the last 10 years has repeatedly seen posts from across the political spectrum regarding the social responsibility of business. And primarily, it's aimed at one of two things. It's either people that are decrying the cruel and heartless nature of major corporations who treat their employees like dirt, who hoard these massive profits at the expense of turning all their employees into part-timers so they don't have to pay health care, so on and so forth. Or it is aimed at the politicians on the political side, where they are being criticized for their support of corporate America. And frequently, in fact, just in the last week, I've seen a number of different posts that are dealing with the stimulus bill that was just signed, the $2 trillion. And one of the questions that gets asked is, why are corporations that don't even have their headquarters in the United States being given federal government money during the quarantine period? Why are companies that have posted record profits, like Amazon, posted record profits each year over the last decade, being given federal money during the quarantine? So on and so forth. So a lot of the attitude towards business in social media, and if you accept that social media is a reflection of the mindset of the population, among a majority of members of the population, is what is the responsibility of business to society as a whole. And to this, Milton Friedman had a ready answer. And he basically said, as a business, you have one responsibility, and that is to increase profit. You have no responsibility to sustain your employees. You have no responsibility to satisfy the public in the production of options for your goods and services. You have no social responsibility to keep your headquarters in the United States. You have no social responsibility to lower prices during a crisis, so on and so forth. You have absolutely zero social responsibility. Your only responsibility is to increase profits. Because if you are increasing your profits, you are A, benefiting the people who were willing to invest in your company when you needed operating capital. So a reward system. And B, you are presumably taking some of that profit and reinvesting it back into growth of the business so as to assure that you can continue to provide your goods and services. So your social responsibility is to increase profits, but he put a limit on that when he said you have to play within the rules of the game. And when he says that, what he means is you must engage in business where open and free competition between your business and other businesses of a similar nature is the rule. Without deception, without fraud. This means that you cannot, under your social responsibility of profit making, you cannot go to government and ask government to pass rules that will keep your competition out of the market. You cannot go to the government and ask for bailout money that you're going to turn around and spend on executive bonuses for a failing business. You cannot corner a market. You cannot lie. Truth in labeling is a big deal, so on and so forth. Anything that involves deception or fraud, anything that involves the stifling of open competition in the marketplace automatically rules you out as being a responsible company. So in order to be socially responsible as a company, you must make profit, but you must do it in an environment that is constructed of free and open competition without deception or fraud. And I think if you hit play on this particular slide, the video that you'll get is actually a question and answer period that Milton Friedman was doing with some college students, where he goes into a little bit more detail about why he believes corporate America has no other social responsibility. Let's look at monetarism for a minute. Monetarism is really nothing more than a descriptive term that talks about how the government controls the amount of money that is in circulation in the economy. Now, while people say that Milton Friedman promotes a theory of monetarism, it is true that he promotes a specific theory on the limits that should be imposed on government's control of the money supply. But he also believes that some government control is necessary. because under the theory of monetarism, um, if money was a free-range chicken in our economy, bad things might happen. So the government, while their role should be minimal, under the theory of monetarism, the government is still going to be slightly involved. So it basically, the theory emphasizes the role of the government as opposed to emphasizing the actual supply of money that's in circulation. And under the theory of monetarism, the variations in the money supply, and we've talked about these before, it's the amount of money that is physically printed and put into circulation by the Federal Reserve, but it's also based on the amount of money available um, through the control of interest rates. The variations in that supply of money have extraordinary impact. Very small variations have an extraordinary impact on the up or down movement of the economy as a whole. And over the short run, um, adjustments in the money supply uh, can actually uh, can actually have a significant effect nationally on the health of the economy. But in the long term, it significantly affects those price levels, both retail prices and the price of raw materials and the cost of services. So it also deals not just with whether or not the economy is capable of producing, but over the long term, it is going to control or it is going to significantly affect um, inflation. So one of the things that Milton Friedman points out is when we push more money into circulation, it is inherently inflationary. And we talked about this before when we talked about control of the interest rates. When you have a lot of money in circulation, people have um, presumably more disposable income. They're willing to go out and they're willing to spend more. And if they're willing to spend more, the demand for any particular product or service is likely to increase because people have more money to spend. They're willing to go out and buy more things. And when that demand outstrips the capability of corporate America to supply that good or service, in order to differentiate between who really wants it and who just wants it because it's there, prices will start to go up. The people that are willing to pay more will offer more in order to win a bidding war. And as soon as you hit the highest price that somebody is willing to pay, you've essentially established a new value for that product or service. And the equilibrium price is going to increase as well. So by putting more money into circulation, you do stimulate demand, as John Keynes said, but under the theory of monetarism, you're also going to drive inflation. And if you remember yesterday, we talked about um, the impacts of interest rates dropping too far or too fast, overcapitalization, hypercapitalization, and then massive inflation. Um, and we can see some of this going on right now. If you look at the current situation where we're in a recession, where we're at the beginning of a recession caused by this quarantine, which has severely cut demand across the board by keeping people home. Um, the government is taking several steps in order to try to keep the economy um, floating. And among those, the Federal Reserve immediately cut interest rates to free up credit. But you also saw the Federal Reserve do what is called quantitative easing. And I want you to go look that up online. Quantitative easing. And what quantitative easing is a very fancy term for printing more money and shoving it into circulation. Literally, the Federal Reserve is printing more $20 bills and shoving them into circulation every day. And in its extreme, as more and more money goes into circulation, obviously, more and more money is available to create demand. But we can look at some countries that have used quantitative easing excessively. Italy in the 1970s, a lira used to be, I don't know, 5, 10 lira to the dollar. And through a series of events in the Italian economy over about a 20-year period, culminating in the 1970s, the Italian government was attempting to stimulate their economy by pushing more and more currency into circulation. And by the time I got to Italy in 1984, it was 1,700 lira to the dollar. They had devalued the currency so much by simply printing up more paper and pushing it out that inflation had been running at better than 100% per year for several years. We've seen that even more recently, just in the last 3 to 5 years, down in Venezuela, as their government actually was clamping down on the economy. And the economy got sluggish, and the government started a series of steps in quantitative easing. And there were, I saw photographs of people basically pushing around a wagon full of pretty much useless paper money. And Venezuela attempted to fix their problem by doing what's called a devaluation. Basically, they print up a new $1 bill and they tell the public, hey, this new $1 bill is worth 50 of your old $1 bills. Bring all your dollar bills to the bank and turn them in, and we'll issue new currency. And this doesn't change the fact that inflation is still going to keep increasing prices. You have to fix inflation in order to get that to stop, but it shows the effect that it has on essentially the worth of the currency. So under the theory of monetarism, the more money you push into circulation, whether it's through quantitative easing or whether it's through the lowering of interest rates, you are going to drive inflation. And if you push an excessive amount of money into circulation, you are going to drive excessive hyperinflation. The theory of monetarism stresses that government authorities should actually focus on what's called price stability. So instead of messing with the money supply, what the government should be doing is they should be focusing on ways to keep prices in what's called a slow growth cycle. If you do any research at all on what's called gross domestic product, the gross domestic product is the sum total of everything produced in a country in any given year. And growth in gross domestic product is said to be most healthy when it's between 1.5% and 3% per year. Right around 2% is viewed as a perfect growth rate for gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is calculated using wholesale pricing as its metric. So according to monetarism, according to the Chicago School, if the government focuses on keeping that growth rate in that 1.5% to 3% range, with 2% being what's considered near perfect, by focusing on the slow growth in gross domestic product, they are de facto keeping prices in the market stable enough that neither inflation nor recession is going to become an issue. Now, in order to drive some of those ideas, you may or may not be aware of it, but up until um, the 1930s. I want to say it was 1933 or 1934. United States currency was actually printed instead of on dollars like we have now. It was printed on dollar bills that, um, if you pull out a dollar bill, look at the top, it says Federal Reserve Note at the top, right above Washington's head. Back in the 1930s and earlier, the government actually backed currency with reserves of precious metals. And you could actually pick up a dollar bill from the 1920s, 1930s, and at the top it would say gold certificate. And um, where you look on the dollar bill and you see that little entry that says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. On a gold certificate, it said something along the lines of, at any time you can bring this bill to a federal bank and they will issue you a dollar's worth of gold bullion in return for this certificate. Your money was literally backed by gold. Now, 1930, 33 or 34, I think, Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order basically making it illegal for private citizens to own gold. And they actually seized all the gold coins that were in circulation at the time, and the ones that people didn't rat hole away, like coin collectors and such. They seized gold coins, they melted them down to gold bullion, they put that gold bullion in Fort Knox, and that became the country's gold reserve. Now, gold certificates kind of died out, I think, in the early 40s. The last time I remember a written reference to them was Charles Lindbergh actually paid a ransom for his son's kidnapping using gold certificates. And that was sometime in the late 30s, early 40s. But I remember in my own lifetime silver certificates, which were the same thing as gold certificates, but redeemable for silver, still being in circulation in the late 50s and early 60s. In fact, as a coin collector, when I was a kid, um, I delivered newspapers, and every month I would go around and I would collect for the newspapers. And I remember collecting $3.25 a month from each one of my customers. And whenever I got home, I would immediately open up my little money bag and I would go through all the money. And every once in a while, I would find a silver certificate in the paper money, or I would find silver dimes or silver quarters in the loose change, because we were still producing silver money up until 1964. Now, when Richard Nixon was president in the 1970s, he actually took the United States off the gold standard. And so US currency, regardless of what was printed on the face of the dollar bill, US currency was no longer backed by collateral. Federal Reserve notes, as they are today, are nothing more than an IOU from the federal government saying, we think this dollar bill has 100 pennies worth of value, and we're willing to back that up with our good faith and promise. And there's a lot of people that criticize that as being um, a foolish move. But in the theory of monetarism, Milton Friedman firmly believed that the gold standard was a problem for the economy, because if the government is going to use the money supply to adjust economic activity up or down in an effort to try to keep price stability in focus, if you're tied to a gold standard, you can never print more money than the amount of gold you actually have in that vault in Fort Knox. So by keeping us on the gold standard, we had a cap on how much money we could print. And so when Richard Nixon removed that cap and said, we're not going to limit ourselves to the amount of precious metal that the US government has in reserve, he actually opened up the ability of the federal government to adjust that money supply um, up or down with more impunity. The last thing that they talk about in the theory of monetarism is the idea of unemployment and what's considered a minimum level of unemployment. Now, there's actually two things I'm going to talk about with unemployment. Let me double check something here. Yeah, there's two things we're going to talk about with unemployment. The first one is the idea that there have to be unemployed people in the country in order for the economy to be healthy. I know it sounds stupid, but follow the logic. Um, Labor is a commodity, and you have so many hours every year that you can sell to a company in return for money. So let's say you're a full-time worker, you go in and you're selling 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to some corporation in return for 10, 12, $15 an hour, whatever your wage is. Your labor is a commodity. If you find somebody that's willing to offer more money for the same hours, or somebody that's willing to offer the same money for fewer hours, you're likely to choose to change jobs. And that is how a normal economy functions. Now, the key is that labor, like any other commodity, can run out. If 100% of people in the United States are employed and a new company wants to open for business, where do they get their labor? And the answer is they have to take it from somebody else, which means they have to offer a better deal to the workers, which means they have to expend more money to get the labor force into their shop. And they're going to pass that expense on to the customer in the form of higher prices. So Milton Friedman says that on the scale of unemployment, there's a level right about here that if we go below that level, the unemployment that we're looking at is largely going to be people who are not able to be employed. People who can't physically do the work, people who don't have the mental capacity to do the work, people who are unable to function. We get down into that layer of unemployment, and all of a sudden, we're all competing for the same labor. And that is going to drive inflation up. Now, if unemployment comes up a little bit, so there's always a small pool of qualified workers available. As the business cycle goes through its boom and bust, and people are added to or taken out of that unemployment labor pool, it's actually a soft enough pad where we still have to compete for labor, but there's enough of it there that we don't have to get drastic about it. As unemployment starts to rise, we get into the problem where there's more labor available than companies willing to pay for it. And what you find there is wages and benefits will start to disappear as companies are no longer required to compete for their employees. So that level of unemployment, that minimum level below which we cannot go without driving inflation, is actually, whoops, I hate it when that happens, is actually right around where our unemployment level is right now, somewhere in that 2 to 3% range. Now, that's when we say 2 to 3% unemployment, we're looking at what's called the U3 numbers. And we really need to look at the U6 numbers because the U6 numbers include people that have just thrown their hands in the air and given up looking for work completely. It includes people who would like to work full-time but have a part-time job. It includes people with PhDs working as cashiers, that sort of thing. So we have to look at actually the U6 number, which right now is hovering in that 6 to 7% range. So we actually still have room to play with, but you don't want to get too far below the unemployment minimum unemployment level, because as soon as you do, you are going to start to see inflation um, being driven upwards. And if we get into the world of hyperinflation, of course, we can default the economy back into a depression. Now, I highly recommend, again, that you go to the PowerPoint presentation and click the play link for the video, which will talk about monetarism. I will also make that link available in the comments section on the Google School feed. A couple of things that I do want to mention before we leave, even though they're not on the slide. One is what's called a Phillips curve. And if you remember from your vocabulary sheet, you had econometrics as a vocab term, and I believe you had Phillips curve as a vocab term as well. And what a Phillips curve is it's basically an econometric model that describes what's called the inverse relationship between unemployment and wage hikes. And very simply, it shows that decreased unemployment in the economy is going to correlate with higher rates of wage rises. Now, if you go back to yesterday's issue, actually the day before, low wages equal high employment. The same is also true of high wages equaling low employment. But what the Phillips curve is going to show is that as unemployment goes down, wages are going to go up. And that is this right here, that minimum level of unemployment below which inflation is created. When the unemployment level is so low that companies are competing for workers, the only way to lure workers away from another company is to give them a better deal. So under the Phillips curve and the theory of monetarism, when you look at the Phillips curve, and we'll take a look at this when we talk about demand versus supply later on in the semester. But you can see on the Phillips curve where unemployment lines and wage lines will cross is what's called the equilibrium point, the equilibrium wage and the equilibrium point of unemployment. And that's the point where pretty much everybody is paying the same salary and the same benefits. When the government tries to establish what's called a price floor, in the case of wages, that would be the minimum wage. What they effectively do is they either create a shortage of jobs driving unemployment, or they create inflation as the cost of additional labor is passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. So the Phillips curve shows effectively how that correlation works. And Phillips does allege causation as well as correlation. The other one is what's called the permanent income hypothesis. And I'm just going to touch on this because it's an interesting point. I'm old, and I'm a decade away from being completely retired. And when I retire and I'm no longer drawing a full salary for my work, my income is going to decrease. And I've got money that I've set aside over the years that's built up my retirement fund. Um, but the income that I get from my retirement funds is never going to be enough to actually completely replace my salary afterwards. So the the permanent hypothesis, permanent income hypothesis, is based on the fact that my temporary income is what I'm earning now, whether it's from a collection of my military pension, my teacher's salary, my dividends and interest from stocks and investments, all added together. What I'm getting now is my temporary income. My permanent income is what I'm going to be earning when I retire and start living off of whatever I've got set aside in individual retirement accounts, 401ks, Social Security, disability, whatever income is coming in my golden years. And what the hypothesis says is that we as individuals tend to make our spending decisions based not on our temporary income, not the income that we're making now. As we get older, we start to think ahead to that permanent income, and we start making our purchasing decisions as if the permanent income was the income we were already getting. So when you're young and dumb, um, people tend to live paycheck to paycheck without thinking about setting money aside. Hey, I got $1,000 in, I got $1,000 going out. Life is short, enjoy it. But the closer that you get to retirement age, the older that you get, the more that you're actually going to start looking at that permanent income, and the more that your spending is going to change. And the reason that this is important to mention under the theory of monetarism is because traditional Keynesian thought emphasizes what's called the marginal propensity to consume. If you recall, John Keynes said it's okay to invest money, but it is not okay to save money, because if you are saving money, you are in fact taking that money out of the economy, and therefore you are reducing demand. And by reducing that demand, you are hurting the economy overall. What Milton Friedman is saying is you need to have saved money, because if you don't have saved money, when you get to your retirement years, your permanent income is going to be here instead of here. And if your permanent income is down here, when you're in your 40s, your 50s, even your 60s, you're looking at that number and you're adjusting your spending downward because you see the writing on the wall. You see it coming down the highway. You see the light at the other end of the tunnel. And you're trying to get your lifestyle in line with the spending that's going to be available to you in your retirement years. So the more money that you save, the higher that permanent income becomes, and the greater opportunity that your spending habits are not going to be reduced as you age out. So a direct contradictory statement from Milton Friedman to John Keynes. That is the last slide that I have on Friedman. Tomorrow we will be starting with Arthur Laffer, our last economist and the only one that is still alive. I again heartily encourage you, go back and read the biography of Milton Friedman. I would encourage you to also read the biography of Arthur Laffer before tomorrow's video. Again, if you pull up this PowerPoint presentation in Google Classroom, you can click through the links to watch these videos. I will also post those links in the chat feed in Google Classroom. And I will remind you that information from those videos will appear on the exam. So I know some of you hate to sit through a video, but it might be the difference between, a 69 and a 71 on your exam. So I would go ahead and sit through them at least once and probably take notes while you're listening. Um, at the very least, you don't have to watch me dance to the music because obviously I'm not there when you're watching the video. And as always, I will also remind you that if you have any questions at all, or you have any problems accessing the material, feel free to hit me up on email. Feel free to leave a comment in the classroom feed here on Google Classroom, and I will get back to you as quickly as is humanly possible. So thanks for paying attention, and I will see you tomorrow.